From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
I will just say that this morning I was reflecting on lectures we'd had previously, and I remembered that probably about 2003 we had the author of this book, The Seashell on the Mountaintop, Alan Cutler, who's a geologist, works at the Smithsonian, local guy, so he came and talked about pretty much the beginnings of geology. And there was an Italian person who ultimately became a saint, and that was Nicholas Steno, which I don't know if people learn about that in geology classes, but he was one of the Medici darlings. And people were always wondering, why on a mountaintop would you find a seashell? So he worked on this and found out why. And now, of course, 3 or so centuries later, we have people who are going to planets and doing the same sort of thing, getting the rocks and other debris and studying it. In fact, I was just reading that we still have the lunar rocks from the 70s, and people are still studying them and finding out new things. So today, we are very excited to have a planetary geologist. We've had so many astrophysicists, so this is our second planetary geologist. We had one of her colleagues, Dr. Bleacher, back in 2012, and he talked about the Desert Rats missions, which we'll hear about again today. So Kelsey Young is pretty new at NASA. She's been a postdoc there and now full-time, and she's got some other affiliations that she can mention. So I will just tell you where she went to school. People always want to know. And she had her BS in Environmental Geosciences from Notre Dame, an MS in Geological Sciences from Arizona State University, and also her PhD from Arizona State University in Geological Sciences. So we'll get started right away and hear what Dr. Kelsey Young has to say.
Okay, so I have a dual affiliation with the NASA Johnson Space Center in Houston and the NASA Goddard Space Flight Center here in the DC area. And I basically work between the centers and sort of at the intersection of the science and human exploration communities. I'm a planetary field geologist, so I study methods and techniques for conducting field geology on other planets. So who I am, what I do, I sort of just gave you a spoiler alert on that first bullet. So I did my bachelor's at Notre Dame, studying analog features in Iceland, so volcanic features in Iceland that look like similar features we see on the surface of Mars. Then I got my master's and my PhD at ASU before coming here to Goddard, and I recently transitioned to being full-time, split between the Goddard Space Flight Center and the Johnson Space Center. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about solar system exploration, the methods by which we do this, both robotic and manned spaceflight to explore our solar system. I'm going to be talking a little bit about analog testing, so integrated field campaigns meant to prepare us for sending humans back to other planetary surfaces. I'm going to talk about field portable instruments, so high resolution tools and techniques that we use in the field to tell us about the geology of an area. And then I'm going to look forward to sort of where we're going next as a human spaceflight community. So solar system, obviously planets are to scale, distances are not. So NASA has been working for decades to explore the solar system. We've sent orbiters, rovers, and we've even sent humans out into the solar system to investigate all these planetary bodies here. And I had to leave Pluto on there. And we've even sent an orbiter out past the end of the solar system now. So we've sent orbiters to every single planet shown here in this image. But we're starting to get a higher resolution look at some of the surfaces of these planets through rovers, and again, hopefully through sending humans to Mars and beyond. So here are all of the planetary missions that are either in operation right now or in development for the future. Definitely won't go through all of these, but in the inset in the box there, you see the orbiters and rovers specifically on the Martian surface. Missions that I'll talk about later are the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, which is an orbit around the moon. Rosetta actually just ended. It was a European Space Agency mission. that just ended a couple weeks ago. OSIRIS-REx just launched actually about a month and a half ago to go and collect a sample and bring it back from an asteroid. So lots of exciting missions right now that NASA's currently running and that we have planned for the future. Actually, I think about half an hour ago, ExoMars entered Mars orbit and actually sent a lander to the surface, literally at 11 o'clock this morning. So there are a lot of really exciting things happening. What I work on specifically is sending humans out beyond our planet. So that's what I'm going to focus on today. So of course, we have one example of sending humans beyond the Earth to conduct field geology on another planetary body. We have 6 surface missions that sent 12 people to the moon from 1969 to 72. They were collecting samples with tools like you see here. That's Apollo 17 astronaut Jack Schmitt collecting a sample of the lunar regolith with a rake. They actually deployed surface science experiments. So for example, they deployed seismometers on the lunar surface to study moonquakes. And they used a lunar roving vehicle, which you can see here in the bottom of the picture, that enabled them on Apollo 15, 16, and 17 to travel even farther out from the lunar lander. So I'm going to be talking a lot about the intersection of science and exploration. And I just wanted to highlight at the beginning one mission that I mentioned earlier that is a prime example of doing this. So the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter has been in orbit around the moon for the past several years. It was initially funded as a joint project between the Human Exploration Office and the Science Mission Directorate. So it was intentionally funded by both programs to initially select landing sites for future human missions to the moon, and then the human community was going to transfer it over to the scientists to allow them to conduct new lunar science. So I won't go over all the instruments, but they're listed here. But this instrument suite was specifically selected to allow for this blend of science and exploration. So an example here is the Apollo 17 landing site. If you look closely, you can actually see the tracks that the Apollo 17 astronauts made on the lunar surface. This is the lander that they actually did their EVAs from, or extravehicular activities. Then, for example, right on the left is that seismometer experiment that I told you they deployed. So you can actually see this in really high resolution detail with the LRO mission. This is an interesting story for any engineers in the audience. When the Apollo astronauts traveled to the lunar surface, they actually jettisoned boosters that crashed into the lunar surface before they landed. We had found almost all of them, could not find the Apollo 16 boosters, and through the LRO instrument package, we were actually able to find the impact crater made by the booster impacting into the lunar surface. So the types of data products that we're generating with this mission are something like what's given on the right. This is a paper published this year. And basically this image shows a blend of multiple LRO data sets that were blended together to create a traverse path for a lunar polar rover that's going to search for volatiles in the lunar polar region. So this right down here is a permanently shadowed region. It never sees the sunlight. We're going to send a rover in and around those PSRs to look for volatiles. And this instrument package will allow us to traverse plan for missions like this that will benefit human exploration. But again, we always have scientific drivers for planetary exploration missions. These are 3 missions in particular that highlight missions to bodies that humans could one day go and sample in person. Of course, we've already been to the moon, and I've talked a lot about LRO. This is the Mars Science Lab, the Curiosity rover that's currently operating on the Martian surface. And then, like I mentioned earlier, OSIRIS-REx launched to an asteroid in September, and it's going to bring a sample of an asteroid back to Earth. So we've made massive advancements since Apollo in terms of lunar science. Like you mentioned, lunar samples are still being studied to this day. There's actually a fraction of the Apollo samples that we haven't even touched yet. So we're still getting a lot of really robust lunar science out of them, but they've also raised new science questions about the history of the moon and how it evolved in conjunction with our planet, as well as the rest of the planets in the inner solar system. So the areas of interest that we're looking at here and that human beings will look at regardless of the destination they eventually go to: geology, geophysics, geochemistry, atmospheric science, life-related chemistry, and the search for life on Mars. And all of these require varying levels of human interaction, but all of them would benefit from the inclusion of a human being on whatever planet that we eventually end up going toward. So like I said, the destinations for future human missions include small bodies, the moon, going back to the moon, and eventually the journey to Mars. All of these destinations come with varying levels of complexity. For example, the moon is relatively close by, of course, and the communications delays associated with a mission control center here in Houston talking to astronauts on the lunar surface are negligible. However, when you go to Mars, you can have up to about a 30-minute round-trip communication delay. So it's really important that we as scientists, engineers, operators learn how to operate under that 30-minute time delay. Of course, they have varying atmospheric and gravity conditions. You see a artist's concept of a human being operating around an asteroid. You'd need to stabilize the astronaut somehow while they were collecting samples from that asteroid. So varying atmospheric and gravity conditions really have an impact on how you conduct science at that body. And therefore, developing flexible technology now in advance of these missions is crucial to understanding how you would even work in these environments. And at NASA, we have a lot of platforms that allow us to investigate all three of these different destination classes and how you'd operate in them scientifically. So, the journey to Mars. NASA's all about the journey to Mars right now. This is a pretty complicated sketch that sort of funnels into how we're going to get from here on Earth to the surface of Mars. So, of course, we have the International Space Station in orbit around Earth right now. I'll talk about it a little bit more later. And eventually, we're going to move out to the moon with the Orion capsule. Then we're going to use the Space Launch System, a heavy rocket, to get a lot of mass and payload to the Martian surface and the Martian atmosphere. NASA also has the asteroid redirect mission on the books to go to an asteroid, bring a boulder back into lunar orbit, and sample that boulder. We also have many orbiters and landers, rovers around Mars right now, including the Schiaparelli lander from today. And eventually, all of this is going to give us an orbit around Mars and on the surface to Mars. And that includes Mars's moons, Phobos and Deimos. That's part of NASA's journey to Mars right now. And this whole construct shows how we're going to build from Earth to the surface of Mars. So this shows it in sort of a different way that I like. So basically the Earth Reliant System here, that's ISS, right? These missions last from 6 to 12 months. Actually, 3 men launched this morning to the International Space Station. So we had 1 NASA astronaut and 2 Russian cosmonauts launch at about 4 a.m. To go to International Space Station. So these missions can range from 6 months right now to up to a year. Scott Kelly just got back from his year in space. So we describe this as an Earth Reliant System. Houston Mission Control is constantly in the loop, as well as mission control centers from the other space agencies that form the International Space Station. But eventually we want to move out, right? We want to move to the proving ground. And these missions we're conceptualizing can last for between 1 and 12 months. And it's going to lunar orbit. It's going to complete this asteroid redirect mission. And it's all to get us ready for the Mars Ready systems, which will take us to Mars on the order of missions from 2 to 3 years. So we need to learn how humans can survive in space that long, how we can land on and launch off of the Martian surface. And specifically what I'm interested in is how you conduct science from the Martian surface or in orbit around the Martian surface. We want to move forward from Apollo, right? And right now, NASA is heavily involved in the International Space Station. So the International Space Station shown here, it's the size of a football field and it orbits Earth every 90 minutes. So the crew members on board ISS get a, front row seat to the Earth's surface processes that are shaping our planet and the processes that shape other planets. So they're learning a lot scientifically about how the world works, how Earth's surface processes work. They're observing volcanic eruptions in real time. They're observing hurricanes hitting the coast of the US in real time. They can see all this happening, and what's important and what I'll talk about later is to train them to observe these processes and send back lessons learned to the scientists here on Earth that study them. So they're observing Earth, they're conducting science experiments, and they're learning how to survive in space for long periods of time. So they study macular degeneration. How are your eyes affected from being in low gravity for so long on the way to Mars and coming back? How is your bone density affected? How's your balance affected? And what's going to happen when you land on the surface of Mars after traveling for months and need to put on a spacesuit and go outside? How is your body going to respond? And of course, we're also heavily involved in partnerships with private companies. So here's Kate Rubins and Jeff Williams capturing a Dragon from SpaceX. So all of the activities that are going on ISS right now are crucial in preparing us to operate in this Mars system in the journey to Mars. But the rest of the talk, I'm going to focus on actually conducting science on other planets, planetary surface exploration. So the question I think about every day is, what do we need to do to get ready to send humans to these destinations? And of course, a big part of this is test, test, test. You've got to test, go back to the drawing board, redesign, and test again. So this requires an ongoing, integrated approach between science, operations, and technology to understand how we're going to operate in this way. So moving forward, and the things I'm going to talk about today our integrated testing and analogs, so these operational field tests that allow us to test multiple components of a system in one place. Then we move forward to actually, when you're on EVA, on a spacewalk, what instruments do you need to collect scientific data? And then how does a crew need to be trained to use those instruments? How are they trained to actually be our proxy as geologists, as scientists, to get the data that we need on Mars? And all this will hopefully feed forward into an exploration mission and eventually NASA's journey to Mars, which you've heard me say already 10 times, and you can expect it at 10 more. So this is an eye chart. Don't worry about reading it. But this is sort of just an example of the analog projects that NASA's relying on in the past and currently moving forward to get ready. So of course, we have the Apollo missions. That taught us a lot about how to conduct science on other planets. It was with no communication delay, which we're going to need to test moving forward to Mars, but it's a really robust way for us to test science operations procedures in planetary surface exploration. We've got the Mars robotic missions. While those don't have human beings on the surface of Mars, it's teaching us a lot about how to operate under a communications delay, what kind of scientific instruments are going to be useful on the Martian surface, and how to operate on Mars with a mission control room in the loop. We have the NEMO missions, which I'll talk about, NASA Extreme Environment Mission Operations, and that's a mission. Do you like how they build an acronym into the acronym? It's the most NASA thing ever. So you have human crew members living underwater for weeks at a time and operating under varying communication delays with a back room. You've got the Desert Rats missions, which I'll talk about as well, and that's a technology development platform for spacesuits and rovers that will allow astronauts to travel farther than ever before from the landers they use to get to the surface of Mars. We have scientific field campaigns. What scientific instruments do we need when operating on the surface of Mars? How do we use them? These are scientifically motivated campaigns. And you also have other campaigns, like for example, ISRU, to learn what technology you would need to mine resources in situ on the surface of Mars. So I'll talk about a lot of these for the remainder of the talk. Terrestrial field testing in advance of a planetary exploration mission is nothing new. This is one of my favorite pictures. This is the Apollo 17 crew, Jack Schmitt, the only geologist to ever go to another planetary surface, and Gene Cernan testing out in the San Francisco volcanic field north of Flagstaff, Arizona, where we tested the Desert Rats rovers right here. This is just a few miles away from each other. So this is nothing new. We need to actually go in a relevant analog environment to test these technologies and operational protocols to get us ready for when we're really doing the real thing. So again, eye chart, but this is just to show these are all of the analog projects that NASA is involved in right now, moving forward toward the surface of Mars, toward the exploration of Mars. I'll talk about a few of these right now, but each one of these analogs tests something different, right? There's one, Hera, that's a habitat on site at NASA Johnson in Houston that's actually testing human factors. So how do you figure out how a human crew is doing on long duration spaceflight? It's for the behavioral analysis folks at NASA to understand how human beings will react in this situation. High Seas is another one. That's a habitat on the flanks of Mauna Loa in Hawaii. They just finished their year-long mission where a crew was living in this habitat for a year, figuring out how they're going to react in this environment. Desert Rats and NEMO are on here, but each one of these analog missions tests something different that we'll need as a community to get ready for crewed spaceflight. So what is an analog? What do I mean when I say an analog test? This is a multidisciplinary field test, so science, operations, technology, that allows for end-to-end testing of operational concepts and hardware, technology, software in a real operational environment. So something where scientists, engineers, technology developers can work together in this integrated environment to understand how to play off one another and how to develop technology that fits the needs of the community. And what we do as a community, and we do it in the scientific community and we do it in the crewed spaceflight community, is to evaluate objectives that map to specific needs and technology gaps in the community. So if a spacesuit engineer wants to understand how to build a suit that's going to allow a field geologist on another planet to bend down and pick up a sample, we need to understand that, right? We need to speak each other's language and talk to each other. So these analog missions are designed to meet those knowledge and technology gaps in crewed spaceflight. And this has benefits across crewed spaceflight. So ISS, what we're doing now has direct benefits to the crew, the 6 crew that are on ISS right now. And then, of course, this has direct benefits to moving forward to exploration EVA. So Desert Rats, this is the first analog mission I'm going to talk about. Here's the Desert Rats 2010 family photo. So you've got 2 habitat rovers that link up to a habitat laboratory, assuming that you have a long duration stay on another planetary surface. So Desert Rats, or the Research and Technology Studies, we love our acronyms, consisted of an integrated team of engineers and scientists, including a lot of NASA centers, other agencies, military, academia, private partners, students, that came together for a couple weeks a year in the desert to test technology like this. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the technology and sort of lessons learned moving forward from these DRATS tests. So we have this habitat rover. These are designed to support a crew of 2 for long duration traverses on another planetary surface. So specifically in the Desert Rats missions, each rover contained a crew of 2, 1 astronaut and 1 field geologist, again, trying to teach each other how to talk to each other, how to work together. Here's a view from the front seat. The astronaut would sit here, geologist would sit here, and they drive the rover with this panel of controls using a joystick. And then we do EVAs. So here I am with Stephanie Wilson from JSC. We go out and we do 3 or 4 EVAs per day designed to collect samples and interrogate the geologic history of the San Francisco volcanic field in Arizona. We had sample collection technologies. So believe it or not, these tools that were mounted on the back of the rover were modeled directly from the Apollo tools. They started there, right? It worked for them, right? So we're going to build forward from this Apollo sample collection suite and learn what's needed, what do we need to change for actually doing this on Mars, going back to the moon, asteroids. And then the final thing that we tested specifically in 2010 was the Habitat Lab. So you could actually dock to the side of this lab. This sort of popcorn top on the top is where we slept. So there was also a geologic glove box in there. So they had scientific instruments in the glove box that you could reach in and manipulate the samples that you collected on Traverse inside that habitat lab. And so the test, redesign, test again, that whole philosophy really came true in Desert Rats. You'd test 1 year, you'd meet all year to discuss what modifications you needed to make to the hardware, and you'd come back with a new iteration to test. And in this way, we really made these giant strides because we were working together as scientists and engineers to understand what the other community needed. And if I'm a scientist and I want the moon, right, I want it all, the engineer is going to say, that's just never going to happen. You need to come to grips with that. So it's learning how to interact with each other and build forward from the previous year's iteration. We also tested operations. So integrated EVA science operations. That's something I think a lot about, right? And that's the same idea we've been talking about. Scientists want to accomplish a set of scientific objectives on EVA. The EVA engineers and operators are responsible for keeping their astronauts safe. So it's understanding how to work together in that framework to accomplish your scientific objectives. So in RATS, we were examining the operational concepts to understand that interaction. How does mission control, working through a science backroom, and the astronaut crew interact together to accomplish your scientific objectives? We modified procedures for sample collection. This is a screen grab from one of the interfaces we had as crew, one of the cameras mounted on our shoulder, to understand how, once you say, I want that rock over there, how do you go from getting that rock over there to a rock that's packaged and curated for return to Earth? There's a lot of steps. I can tell you it's a big time hit every time you want to collect a sample. So it's understanding how to streamline those procedures so sample collection doesn't take so long and fits into that EVA timeline. We had crew training too. A real benefit of this was bringing these astronauts out in the field, sticking them in a box for a week with a geologist and forcing them to listen to us talk about rocks, right? So it's a really good way to train the crew to get excited about geology, to understand geology, because they're the ones that are going to be doing it one day. So of course, we had science objectives. So like I said, we were operating in a volcanic field north of Arizona. Here's a geologic map produced by the science team for RATS in the weeks leading up to the mission. They used this geologic map created from aerial images to develop the traverse plans for the rovers. And then of course, we'd get there, we'd go boots on the ground and we'd say, nope, nope, nope. And it's all about refining that geologic map created from data that's just not as good as what's available to you on the ground. And again, we picked this area because it's a really good analog site to sites we see on the moon and Mars. So understanding more about how this volcanic process shaped the region will inform us about similar processes on the moon and Mars. And of course, we were collecting samples, we were geologic mapping, we were answering terrestrial science questions about how that area formed and in what area were these flows and cones and placed on top of one another. And then this, all these Desert Rats missions didn't just, they did end. We're not taking the rovers out to the desert anymore, but we're still getting a lot of really robust science and operational information out of them. So we do follow-up science. I got back just this weekend from a trip to the Desert Rats field sites designed to understand the geophysical properties of the area. So we're still using what we learned years ago to move forward to understanding surface processes. Moving on to NEMO. NASA Extreme Environments mission operations, conducted in the Aquarius Reef Base, sunk several miles off the coast of the Florida Keys. A crew of 6 lives underneath the water in ARB and conducts a series of EVAs every day for, in this case, a 16-day mission. We just completed Nemo 21, so we've run 21 of these things. Nemo 21 was run in July and August of this year, and we completed a variety of exploration EVA as well as ISS tasks. We had an international crew. We had people from NASA. We had 2 NASA astronauts, as well as ESA, European Space Agency participation, as well as science PIs who served on the crew to help the crew understand how to conduct those scientific experiments. And so we had backroom support from, across NASA, across European Space Agency, DoD research institutions, as well as university and industry partners. One of the pictures I like from this mission is Matthias. He's from the European Space Agency, and what you see him doing there is working with the mini DNA sequencer that Kate Rubins just ran on International Space Station. So they were refining the procedures in ISS that Kate would eventually use on ISS to sequence the first DNA in space. So science objectives. We were conducting coral nurseries. Actually, the EVA and in the first week of Nemo, the astronaut crew constructed the deepest ever coral nursery in the world. So they constructed coral nurseries at 50 and 90 feet, where they basically would put these tiny little cards with coral samples on them to understand how these different species of corals grow at different depths, so we can repopulate damaged reefs around the world. We were doing follow-up science from Nemo 20, which happened last year. So we were understanding how these corals have evolved in the year since we last saw them. And we were doing new science. We were exploring new areas in the area around the Aquarius Reef Base. Operations. Again, this is a complicated chart, but it's one I spend a lot of time thinking about. So integrated EVA science operations. How do you work with astronauts on EVA, any astronauts who might be in the habitat, not on EVA, who are there to support them, any sort of mission control room focused on astronaut safety and mission operations, as well as the science back room who wants to accomplish science objectives. That is a very complicated communication pathway, and we need to understand who needs to talk to who and when and how. So that's one of the sort of operational constructs that we specifically were testing at Nemo, and we learned a lot this year. We still have a ways to go. So we were testing operational concepts of navigation, traverse planning. What if you're an astronaut, you see this traverse plan that someone drew up, and they get there and they say, this is not where we want to go at all. You told me to go left, but this coral colony that looks really interesting is over to the right. How do you react to that real time? Is mission control going to be okay with you going right instead of left? We need to understand how that framework works. We tested a couple other things that I won't dwell on, but we tested a new version of optical communications, as well as actually using a remotely operated vehicle underwater while on EVA. We also tested new technology. So this is a cue card with an underwater iPad that the crew could use to navigate while they were underwater. We tested an IV support system, intravehicular. So if you're the crew member supporting your crewmates while they're on EVA, what do you need? What architecture do you need to help them out? And we're also building new science sampling tools in this geology sampling kit. We've tested this over a series of NEMO missions, and how do you sample in this sort of lower gravity environment. So next thing, now that I've talked about analogs, I want to sort of narrow the focus to talk specifically about scientific instruments. So if you're a scientist astronaut on EVA, you want to collect samples, you want to interrogate the landscape, what do you need in your hands to do that? So Apollo astronauts, of course, had basic sample collection technologies like the rake I mentioned earlier. But in the several decades since Apollo, we've come a long way with in situ analytical technologies. One instrument I spent a lot of time with is this portable spectrometer, an X-ray fluorescence spectrometer that in 60 seconds can give you the chemical composition of a rock that you're pointing it at. So the goal of any instrument that we're talking about here is to maximize the science return of the mission and to increase or at least not detract from the efficiency of real-time surface operations. So every time you pull out that instrument, it takes time to decide, I want to use it, I want to open the box, I want to pull it out, I want to turn it on, I want to calibrate it, I want to take the analysis. So every time you're getting that science value added to the mission, it's an operational hit. So understanding and developing instruments that fit this need of increasing science and adding science to your mission detracts from your operational timeline. So we really need to understand this interplay and understand what instruments are worth to include on EVA. And these instruments, they influence sample collection. So if I have 10 rocks in front of me and mission control is telling me I can only bring 5 back. I need a way to high grade that sample suite and select 5 of those 10 samples to bring back. These instruments can help us do that. And they can also help us understand real time, in situ, what we're seeing in front of us. As a geologist, having higher resolution information real time is incredibly helpful to me to understand the geologic history of the region. And I can pretty much guarantee you that that's going to inform, instead of going over there, this data is telling me that maybe I actually want to go look at this problem over here instead. So it influences sample collection as well as your real-time traverse that you're conducting. So the way that we're doing this, that I'm participating in these activities, is through the SURVEY Institute. More acronyms. I spelled it out for you here. So it's through the Solar System Exploration Research Virtual Institute. And that's jointly funded through the human exploration and the science communities, because they recognize that there's a lot of overplay here, and we need to understand each other to develop these types of instruments and operational concepts. So they fund, one of the teams that they fund is the RISE team that I'm funded under, the Remote In Situ and Synchrotron Studies for Science and Exploration team. And so RISE has a really big scope, and it's basically focused on what do humans need in general to get us to conduct surface exploration on other planets. I work on a piece of RISE, and that's understanding field portable instruments. So I'm going to talk to you about what the RISE team is doing in terms of this portable technology idea. So here's sort of our mission statement. Here are the methodologies that we use. You start with a science question, of course, right? I'm a geologist. I like to start with a science question. So you go to a field site. In this case, this is the December 1974 flow on the Kilauea volcano on the Big Island of Hawaii. You start with a science question, and then you identify, hey, what are the portable instruments that in an ideal world I would have with me when I go do field work here on Earth that will help me answer this question? Are there any? Is this a question you even need instruments to answer? But if it is, what are the right instruments? So we evaluate, we answer that science question, we evaluate what role those instruments played in helping us answer that question, and then we, in the spirit of the human exploration side of the house, feed recommendations forward for how to operate these instruments and what technology needs to be developed for planetary surface exploration designed to answer science questions like these. So here's our sort of operational strategy that we used last year. We're actually going out again in a few months, but this was from a May 2015 deployment next to the December 1974 flow. So we had a crew of 3. We had 2 geologists and 1 astronaut on our crew that year. We had a variety of instrument teams. I'll show you the instruments on the next slide, but each of them were responsible for a specific instrument. And then the unique thing about RISE is that one of our goals is to work with science journalism programs. So Stony Brook University actually has a science journalism program where they educate undergraduate students about how to report about science. So we actually, in the semester leading up to the field deployment, we had them down at NASA Goddard so they could see what a NASA center looks like. I went up to Stony Brook and gave a couple lectures to their classes about what it's like to do field work, what the goals of our field project were. And then they came out in the field with us, and we each team, each instrument team and the crew had a science journalism student embedded with us that followed us around the video camera and asked us lots of questions and learned what it was to do science. So that was a really interesting aspect of the RISE project. So here's our field site. This is the Big Island of Hawaii. The 5 volcanoes that make up the Big Island are highlighted here in yellow. Our field site's right down here in the southwest rift zone of Kilauea. You can see the December 1974 flow here. It was erupted from these little red lines that represent the fissures that dumped out all of the magma that made this flow. And you can see the flow flowing down here toward the ocean, which is down here. One of the interesting things about this site is that if you see this sort of hazy white plume right here, that's actually the active plume from the Kilauea caldera on the Big Island. So the plume is floating, right above your head, and when it rains, it sort of pushes that plume down on top of the flow. So it creates some really interesting alteration products that we were looking at with the RISE team and with field portable instruments. So here's a view from the ground on this December 1974 flow. You're standing looking upslope toward the caldera, so that sort of reddish, brownish smoke is actually that plume coming up out of the caldera. And this is what the flow looks like. So it's a great analog environment. It's actually in the Ka'u Desert. It's a desert environment that has brief damp periods when it rains. There's alteration on that flow. You can kind of see sort of whiter products on this darker flow. Those are actually alteration products that result when this plume interacts with the surface of the flow. And it's a great analog for other planetary surfaces because you have these traditional basaltic lava flows that intersperse with basaltic ash, basaltic sediment that's reworked lava flows sort of scattered in amongst each other. And it's got this really low slope flow morphology, which is pretty similar to a lot of areas we see on Mars. So here are the instruments we had out with us. I won't dwell on them. We had sort of broad field of view instruments. So if you can imagine you're an astronaut driving up to your EVA site in a rover, and you have cameras and different types of field of view instruments that you're going to initiate from inside the rover. And that includes multispectral imaging, which tells us about the composition of the surface of the outcrop. You have LIDAR, which is an instrument designed to map surface texture. Then we had ground penetrating radar, which probes the subsurface of the lava flows. We had this handheld spectrometer that I mentioned earlier, as well as a different type of spectrometer that gives you mineralogy or other information about what builds the rock, what the rock is made out of. And then we actually had a kite out with us to provide airborne images. That image I showed a couple slides ago actually was taken from a camera mounted on a kite. And the reason we did that is because it's really hard to fly UAVs right now in national parks, right? So a kite is a good way to sort of work with the Park Service a little bit. And, it's a way for both of us to get what we want. And we got some really spectacular images with it. So I bet you thought you were going to make it out of this talk with no squiggly lines. No can do. I'm a geologist, so I have to show at least one squiggly line. And I won't dwell on it. The purpose is just to show the types of data that we're getting in the field so you can understand what I'm talking about when I'm talking about data from these instruments. So we looked at things like the alteration coatings on the rock. What are these sort of whitish coatings made out of, and do they vary at all? Are they the same across the whole flow? If they vary, how do they vary? How do they change, and why? We looked at this area, it's called a solfatara, a site of hydrothermal alteration. So if there's any heat that's sort of left over from this continuous volcanic activity, it can alter the rock and change the composition and the texture. We also looked at flow morphology and emplacement. I love this image taken with a kite. And this is actually this little dot right here of sort of lighter material is actually the flow that's underneath the December 1974 flow. So it shows you how shallow this flow is. It actually flowed in and around the pre-existing topography, and you can still see islands there. And we see this all over the Martian surface as well. So these instruments are helping us to understand this is how these processes work on our planet, to understand how they're probably working on the Martian surface. But like I said, there are operational considerations of using these instruments. Going back to the desert rats example, like I said earlier, while increased science value is important, what effects does actually using these instruments on EVA have on your timeline? So the RISE experiment is actually building off these desert rats timelines to understand how this might work. So again, just a quick example. Again, you just have one more scientific plot to get out of the way, and then we can move on. Here's a geologic map, like I said, of the desert rats test area. Each one of these black dots represents a place where I conducted an EVA and picked up a sample. So I didn't these are not all the locations we visited, but I just wanted to sort of isolate the problem to show you an example of how these instruments might work. So all these places, we drove the rover, we got out of the rover, we picked up a rock and put it on the rover to take back to Earth. So you can see that this flow right here, this is a really, really young lava flow, relatively young, and it looks really different from everything else around it. It's a lot darker, it outcrops differently, it's bigger and forms these sort of like big cliff faces. It's really dark in color. So you can tell that when you're a geologist astronaut on the ground, this is different than anything else. However, the samples around that flow look pretty homogeneous. It was kind of hard when you're on an EVA with limited time, and we were on the ground for 25 minutes. There's just not a lot of time to stop and think and look at the rock in front of you. If you had infinite time in this area, you're probably sitting in pretty good shape. But for us, we just didn't have a lot of time. So what do we need to maximize that amount of time and tell us about the volcanic history of this region? So the samples around this younger flow, as crew, and the other crew said the same thing, they weren't really able to identify any differences in these rocks, just in the limited time you had. And then once you got back into the rover, you lose your access. You can't see the rocks anymore, right? So even if you saw a rock 2 days later that you're like, this could be similar to what I saw the other day, you can't go back and look, right? So I went and I took all these samples that we collected on our traverse and ran them through with this X-ray fluorescence spectrometer that gives you chemistry. So again, I don't need to dwell on the plots here, but suffice it to say that the samples actually clustered themselves into 3 distinct groups. And when you go back and plot that on the map, hey, you're able to pick out 3 distinct flows. So you have one flow that flows over to the west of SP flow, which is this darker flow. And then you have a younger one that comes off to the east here. And so this is something that we were not able to identify in the field just because of the limited amount of time we had. But this instrument gave us the ability to see those differences. And if we had known that in the field, who knows, it might have altered what we wanted to do with the traverse. We might have spent more time looking for more samples from this flow because we only ended up getting 2 of them. So it might have altered what we did real time. And the operational hit to that, every time I decide to take an analysis with this instrument, it's a 2-minute hit. It's a 60-second analysis time plus whatever documentation, pictures I need to do to make sure I remember where this data came from. So this just helps you understand, every time you decide to use an instrument, and this is actually one of the lower cost hits of an instrument that we use. Some of these instruments can take an hour and a half to deploy. So you need to understand how much science value you get from one of these instruments based on the hit to your timeline. And 2 minutes, you're sitting here being like, she's crazy. 2 minutes is nothing. When you're in an EVA suit and you have, for example, 8 hours to explore this big area, 2 minutes they really start to add up. And the other operational consideration is that if you're an astronaut in a pressurized spacesuit and you're trying to hold a spectrometer up to a rock that has to maintain constant contact with the surface of the rock, and you're tired, you also want to look around. You're on Mars, you want to see what's around, and you're moving your body when you're doing this. So 60 seconds is a long time for me to go up to an astronaut and say, can you just hold still for 60 seconds? So there's a lot at play here. There's a lot operationally at play that we need to understand. So just to sort of sum up the instrument section, we know that field portable instruments are highly beneficial in both sample high grading, figuring out what samples you want to bring back to Earth, and gaining this real-time insight. Selecting an instrument suite is non-trivial. What instruments do you want to bring? I mean, you have this whole host of instruments available to you. What's your priority? What information do you really, really need? And what are you willing to sacrifice to get that information? But selecting this valuable instrument suite should be a priority regardless of target destination. And whatever destination we end up going to, you'll want to tailor your instrument suite specifically toward that landing site area. And we're still working to investigate how we'll effectively integrate these instruments into future EVAs, but we need to continue to test in these relevant analog environments. What's also important to continue to develop, and this is the last short little section, is we need to train the people who are going to be holding these in their hands, right? This is not the answer to science, right? You're not ever going to have an instrument that flashes green for yes, you should return the sample, or red for no, you shouldn't. You need to have a crew that understands how to use them, understands the data, and understands geology. So we're working on training the astronauts who will eventually be flying some of these missions, and that started back in the Apollo days. We say that the Apollo astronauts had the equivalent of a master's degree in geology by the time they flew to the moon. They had hundreds and hundreds of hours of geology training. They went out in the field. They were in the classroom. They worked with the geology traverse planners to understand their specific landing site, to know about the geology they were going to see. And we certainly want to do the same thing with today's astronauts. So what we do, we sort of gear our astronaut training in 3 specific areas. We have astronaut candidate training. So there's a class of astronauts being selected right now as we speak. They'll report to the Johnson Space Center next summer, and we'll start astronaut candidate training. So for 2 years, they're getting all the training they need to know to be a certified astronaut to fly in space. And one of the modules that we train them on is geology. So we go to the classroom. This is the classroom at Johnson Space Center where we taught them about chemistry, mineralogy. We took them to the Apollo Lunar Lab. We took them to the other curation labs at Johnson Space Center. Then we take them in the field. We teach them how to geologic map. We take them to a place in New Mexico where astronauts have been going ever since the Apollo days. Once they graduate from astronaut candidacy and they're now a certified astronaut that's assignable to flight, we don't stop geology training at that point. So like I said, I just got back this weekend from a trip to Arizona. We had Don Pettit out with us to swing a big hammer and look at the seismic structure of this volcanic field. So we'll embed astronauts from the office that aren't assigned to a mission yet within our teams to teach them how we actually do geology real time in the field. And for the RISE campaigns that I help coordinate, they're a part of the planning process. They help us refine our simulated EVA plans before we even get to the field site. And we also can have them be crew members on these analog tests. So this is Kjell Lindgren back in the 2011 Desert Rats mission, and he later flew to space station for 6 months. So we had him out as a crew member in RATS, embedded in our science team as well. So what do we get when we train astronauts how to do geology and how to be interested in geology? We get pictures like this. This is a picture of an erupting volcano in Russia taken from the International Space Station. And it's eruptions like this that this is on a remote island chain in the Pacific Ocean. We would not have known this volcano was erupting if an astronaut hadn't seen it from International Space Station and said, wait a minute, what's that? And called down to Houston, and because of the pictures that they took, they were ready for the next orbit when they came back around. They took this picture, and scientists are able to infer a lot about the eruption dynamics of a specific volcano with pictures like this. And it's because we get them excited, we get them familiar with Earth's geography and what volcanic features are in which part of the world, so that they are able to identify active surface processes like this. And it's images like this that I like to think really get the public excited about science and excited about space. So when we think about this sort of integrated testing approach from the analogs down to the instrument development, down to make sure the crew is trained to conduct science in our stead on other planetary surfaces, all leading us toward an exploration mission, there are public benefits as well, not just to the scientific community at large. And, a perfect example of this is, the Apollo 11 mission, which was the first time we landed a person on the surface of the moon. Here's thousands of people watching in Central Park in New York, the parade when they got back, the excitement of watching a landing on TV. And if you talk to anyone who remembers 1969, I can guarantee they'll know exactly where they were when somebody landed on the moon. And it really incites a lot of public excitement to be able to do things like this. So another example is just from October 17th, from earlier this week, Orbital launched a Cygnus resupply to the International Space Station. So here's the picture from the Wallops launch facility out in Maryland. Here's a picture I took with my iPhone from the balcony of my building. And I was running really late for the launch. I was really nervous I was going to miss it. I was sort of in my pajamas because I didn't expect there to be anybody else out there. And I ran up to the roof, and there was a ton of people up there watching the launch. It was amazing. And so it just, people are excited about it. And I was ashamed that I was shocked that there were so many people up there watching the launch. And, we opened the door to the roof, and we could hear the audio from NASA TV because everybody had it up on their phones. So people are excited. And this is a resupply going to the station. I think it's docking with station this weekend. And it's giving them, what they need to continue their science experiments on ISS. So there's public excitement, and even more so with all of the SpaceX announcements about Elon Musk and SpaceX going to Mars. So here's a graphic of the Dragon capsule that Elon wants to send to Mars in 2018. So a lot of these private companies have also helped incite public excitement about all of these types of exciting exploration opportunities. So I think I'm excited about it. I think the public's excited about it, and it's an exciting time to work for NASA. So for that, I'll take questions.
I'm excited.
I think we're all excited. What a fun job you have. I'm so glad that you could come and talk to us. I want to mention that our last lecture of the year is the Lunar Reconnaissance Observer, so you can hear more about that. And maybe next year we'll do NEMO or some of these other missions that you've talked about. So yes, we'll have questions, and we ask you to repeat them so everyone can hear the question.
I was wondering how the nursery was doing 1 year later.
Yeah, how the nursery is doing a year later. So we actually only constructed the nurseries in late July of this year. So they've only been up for about 3 months. And they're going down. So I actually was a member of the science team for NEMO. So I worked with the coral scientists who built the nurseries. And I got my hands on building these little cards that you sink underwater. Coral's sharp, by the way. So they actually go down every 3 months to check on them. So they went down there about a month ago, and they were thriving and doing great. So what they're interested in looking at is some species do better than others at certain depths. So they'll go down there and they'll sort of note down which seem to be thriving, which seem to be struggling, and that's the science lesson learned moving forward.
Thanks.
Going easy on me. Yeah.
So part of the goal for the private industry is mineral wealth. Do we know anything about what's on Mars that could be sold here?
Yeah, so like what's valuable on Mars, essentially, and how to tell. So a lot of the private companies aren't really focusing on Mars for mining. They're focusing on asteroids. So they're looking at trace elements that are in really high abundances on specific small bodies. On Mars, we're focusing more on in situ resource utilization. So what's there that humans can capitalize on to help them survive there for long periods of time, and even to sort of like start to manufacture fuel to launch back off the surface and get back to Earth. So from a mining standpoint, Mars isn't as popular of a target, especially because there are planetary protection constraints to worry about too. So we think there could have once been or might currently be life on Mars. And so the Planetary Protection Office at NASA headquarters down the street is pretty stringent about what's even going to be possible in that respect. So with Mars specifically, we're focused on capitalizing on the resources there to help humans survive, not as much about mining. But there certainly are private companies who are really excited about mining small bodies.
I think you were too comprehensive. I wanted to ask, what did I want to ask? These people who were in the training, are they going to be going to the moon? I mean, we might not be going to Mars in time for them.
So the current NASA plan has humans to Mars in the 2030s. So some of the astronauts who are currently in the office and that are being selected right now could potentially be the people who are going to Mars if the plan holds.
Okay.
Was there one in the back? Over there? Yeah.
I'm interested in the specifics of why there's a communication delay of 30 minutes between us and Mars.
It just takes a long time for that signal to get back and forth. And to boost it faster, you need a lot more power, a lot more bandwidth available on the orbiters in orbit around Mars. So just all of the dynamics involved and the engineering involved at the orbiter end make it so that there's quite an extensive communications delay. Yeah.
This may be a linguistics question, but is it still called geology? Should it be xeno something?
No, I like that. Should it still be called geology instead of xeno something? So like for some context, xenoliths are essentially things that are from far away that are there that you're wondering how they got there and why they're there. So for example, xenoliths from the Earth's mantle get brought up to the Earth's surface. And
We've all heard about xenobiology.
yeah, I mean, astrobiology is the common word, or astrogeology.
No, I'm talking science fiction here. People went out to Mars.
Yeah, true. True.
What about the Chinese? How are they doing?
Yeah, so China just had a big launch earlier this week to go to their space station. Yeah, so we don't know a lot about their sort of long-term plan to get humans beyond low Earth orbit. We know there is one, but there's not a lot that's really, we don't work pretty closely with the Chinese like we do with other space agencies. So they're definitely hoping to put humans on the lunar surface sometime very soon in the next couple years. And this launch, I think, proves that for sure. It was a really exciting, great launch. Yeah.
Up to now, the probes that have landed on Mars have tended to avoid the volcanic regions of Mars. Now, you've been going to San Francisco Mountains to Kilauea. Are there any plans to send a probe, a lander, to one of the volcanic regions of Mars, especially maybe to look at possible lava tubes and the like?
Yeah, so a couple points about that question. Great question. So his question was, we've been going to volcanic areas on Earth, but most of the landers and rovers on Mars have gone to non-volcanic areas. So how do you sort of remedy that divide? So we actually do see a lot of volcanic material with the Mars landers and rovers. There's volcanic material pretty much distributed over the entire Martian surface. So it's sort of hard to get there and not see something that was eventually, at some point derived from a volcanic event. And also sort of, I focus for the talk today on volcanic environments, but I've also done a lot of field work, and there are a lot of people doing field work in other terrains that terrains shaped by processes like what we see on other planets, like impact craters, fluvial areas. I focus today on volcanic environments, but there's a lot of other work going on to do field work in other relevant terrains. But in terms of sending something to a more volcanically dominated terrain on Mars, some of them, some of the really big volcanoes are pretty challenging logistically to work in, like Olympus Mons, for example. It would really be challenging from an engineering standpoint to get a rover or lander there. But it's certainly a high interest target, certainly for future Mars exploration.
Is that everybody? I guess we can conclude then. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.